Hello and welcome to episode 33 of A Plain Accounts web series, where every week we discuss at least one of the lectionary passages. And we've been going through Luke for the past few weeks, and we're sticking with it. Today we have Ben Kramer, who's with us as always. Ben, do you want to say hey?
Hey, how's it going?
And we have with us Jeff Bassett. Jeff Bassett has been a visitor, has been a guest and a contributor, both in writing and in these episodes. Jeff, welcome back. Good to see you again. Why don't you remind us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks. Hi. My name's Jeff. I'm a pastor at a Nazarene church in Lone Pine, California, which is about 3.5 hours from anywhere. And so we're way out in the desert, and it's good. I'm glad to be here.
Great. And Jeff, you are a new father. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. You've not been on since Emmaus was born, so congratulations.
Nope. Yeah, it's exciting.
Yeah. Is it everything you'd hoped for and more?
And not only is it everything I hoped for, it's also poopy diapers.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
That's a good time.
Yeah, it's really wonderful.
Good. Well, let's go ahead and jump right in here. We're looking at Luke 13, 10 through 17. And Jeff, I have a small request. As you're in a coffee shop and there's some ambient noise, are you okay muting yourself when you're not chatting for the sake of our guests?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Or muting yourself when you're chatting for the sake of our guest.
He just muted himself, so we don't know what he's saying.
Yeah.
Well, we're looking at Luke 13, 10 through 17, the gospel passage for this 16th Sunday, proper 16. So I will go ahead and read these verses as recorded in the New Revised Standard Version. Now, when he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." When he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites, does not each one of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he had said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things he was doing. This is the written word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Okay, this is an interesting passage. There's some fun stuff going on. So I want to kind of toss it over to you guys. Let's talk a little bit about the context. We can talk about the literary context. We can talk about the historical context. But what is important contextually within this pericope? Anyone? I mean, I could start.
Oh, I was hoping Jeff would jump in there.
Yeah. He did not unmute himself.
He did not. No.
Yeah. Ben, what?
Well, we see Jesus continuing on Jewish business as usual. We've heard throughout Luke praising his Jewishness, and he has continued on with the custom of being in a synagogue on every Sabbath. And he is now, by Luke 13, we've seen this trend of him teaching more often. So he is teaching in the synagogue as he did in his hometown where he gave his first sermon in Nazareth. So he's teaching here as well. So it looks like he has gained favor with the people to some extent to be able to teach and have that authority within the synagogue.
Right.
But I don't think he's winning favor with the synagogue leaders, as is kind of in this passage. So I think what we're seeing socially is some upheavals between those who lead the synagogues and the people that are following Jesus. And at the end of this passage, we see that contrast really vividly, where the people are rejoicing and the synagogue leaders are put to shame.
Right.
So it's important to see that Luke is trying to have us understand the Jewish heritage through Christ, not buck the entire Jewish system. I think that's
Right.
an important thing to understand here.
But it seems like he is a bit of a threat to the establishment,
Mm-hmm.
because this particular pericope is sandwiched by two really interesting parables.
Yeah.
So the parable immediately preceding this one is the parable of the barren fig tree, where Jesus tells the parable of a man who planted a fig tree in his vineyard, and he hoped for fruit but found none, so he told the gardener to cut it down.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus is saying he's looking for fruit-bearing, kingdom-minded people and institutions, and evidently he's not finding that in the synagogue, because then the parable that immediately follows this healing is the parable of the mustard seed. What is the kingdom of God like, and to what should I compare it? It's like a mustard seed. So it's not like I don't know that the synagogue rulers would compare their work to that of a mustard seed.
Mm-hmm.
They might find that to be rather offensive to their work, which is just the best work in the world. It's no small matter. And Jesus is saying, no, this is not coming through these incredible, great systems. It's rather has small beginnings. I'm looking for fruit wherever it's coming. And in our pericope today, then we see that the leader of the synagogue, who we're not told is a Pharisee, but is the leader of the synagogue, takes issue with the healing of this woman.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead,
Does
Jeff.
it? Yeah, I'm wondering if it matters whether or not the leader's a Pharisee, and if that's or not. I think I'm hearing Andy Johnson in the back of my head talking about honor and shame, and the importance of, in a way that we don't understand, that last line, that his adversaries will put to shame. How much that matters, how much that would have mattered, that rather than being honored, rather than being glorified or raised up or anything like that, that the leaders of the synagogue end up being shamed by the end of the passage. That's kind of kicking around, and then I'm also, I think, in part seeing like the conflict piece of, and for me when I was preaching Luke all the way from chapter 9 to 19, you're dealing with, I mean, it's Jesus' movement, his sort of like inexorable movement towards Jerusalem, for those 10 chapters, that like major portion of the book, and that conflict piece is just, it's slowly getting heightened, so that by the end, when they want to kill him, it makes a certain sort of sense. So I feel like I'm seeing some of that, but I just, I don't know. There's definitely a picture of the kingdom in conflict.
Right. So, Jeff, you mentioned the honor and the shame. Can you give us some context about that? Why, this would be a big deal for the synagogue leader to be shamed publicly. In an honor-shame culture like this, why is this a big deal? Can you give us some cultural context here?
I think, just that for us, we don't often have a strong sense of how much honor and shame matters in the ancient world and in the Roman world. But that's really for Luke's readers and for the people that Jesus is interacting with. That question of, are you going to be honored, are you going to be glorified, or are you going to be put to shame? That's the central question of your life.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about um, it's not just about sort of a high school mentality of like I got to sit at the cool kids table, but there's a sort of eschatological element to that
Yeah.
that whether your actions on this earth are glorifying and honoring or shameful has eschatological implications. It's got implications for, for the way we think about it, in terms of all eternity. And so for the leader of the synagogue, who's this person that is a person who lives his life in honor, just like the Pharisees live their lives in honor, to be put to shame publicly is this complete reversal. I mean, and that's the whole scandal of the cross, right?
Right.
Is that the most glorifying thing, the most honoring thing that happens in the gospel is culturally the most shameful.
Right.
And that's the flip. You can see it. That's where Paul goes in I think it's 1 Corinthians. That's where that's the whole thing of Philippians 2, the have in yourself the mind of Christ and all that Christ goes all the way down so you can go all the way up, and all of that kind of stuff. It's all through the New Testament and the Old Testament if we read it and if we kind of have our eyes open to it. So this is a little piece of that.
Right.
That there is this this shaming of the leader of the synagogue it's a power struggle between Jesus and the leader for the hearts and the leadership of the people of Israel.
Right. Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. That provides a lot of the good context. So I want to see if we can chat a little bit about what's going on in the actual passage. It's because it's really interesting to me who's addressing whom and what they're saying to each other. And something that stood out to me was who the leader of the synagogue, who he addresses, is not Jesus. He addresses the crowd, and typically I've interpreted this to be a criticism of Jesus for working on the Sabbath. Jesus shouldn't be doing work on the Sabbath, right? But that's not what the leader of the synagogue says. He's not saying, Jesus, you shouldn't be working on the Sabbath. He's saying to the crowd, there are 6 days to do work. Come and be cured on those days. The crowd, he's chastising the crowd for working on the Sabbath, as if coming to be healed is work. He's not criticizing Jesus for working here. He's criticizing the woman who is healed for coming and being healed. But what's interesting, what blows my mind before that is that she doesn't say she wants to be healed. Perhaps that's intimated. She just appears. She just appears, and then Jesus says, you are set free from your ailment. She doesn't say, Lord, heal me. She doesn't say, Lord, fix me. Jesus just does it, and then she gets crapped on by this leader of the synagogue for being healed by Jesus, who heals her of his own volition. And so then Jesus then doesn't address the leader of the synagogue, or does he? You hypocrites, who's he addressing? Is he addressing the leadership of the synagogue, or is he addressing the crowd? But it kind of changes our understanding, I think, if we see this as, is Jesus doing the work, or is the woman doing the work? And
well, maybe this is reading too much into Scripture, which he can get in trouble doing. But I found it ironic that teaching is not considered work. So Jesus is allowed to continue teaching, but it's only when he heals the woman. And how often we hear people kind of downplay the role of the teacher in schools, or the role of the pastor, the one who teaches,
or the preacher.
Exactly, the preacher. And he is in the midst of giving a sermon when she's healed. So it's in the midst of connecting that teaching of his Father in the synagogue that healing is brought. The purpose of God, which was the purpose of the Sabbath, was to bring release from the bondage of work through Pharaoh. And we are not defined by that bondage and work. The purposes of God is to set the oppressed free, to give sight to the blind, to proclaim freedom to the captives. And so he's in the midst of teaching that and offers it right away. So it's kind of crazy to see how, well, why didn't he stop Jesus from doing the great work of teaching as well? Because it's from the word of God, the teachings of God, that we get this understanding of where true rest and true understanding of what our purpose for work is from the word of God. So that may be a stretch, but
Right. Well, and Scripture says, the Old Testament says, don't work on the Sabbath, but then it doesn't say what work is.
Right.
It was that can be up for interpretation. I mean, there's the law that you are permitted to take your donkey or your ox. You can water them on the Sabbath if you need to, but the Pharisees had introduced, some 600 non-canonical laws, these extra canonical commandments, and so what is constituted as work or not is, I mean, it's very contingent, or it's very much up for interpretation, and we see Jesus kind of fighting against that. One thing I read was that hedge around the law that made it even harder to follow the law, because of all of those extra canonical commandments that were propagated by the temple system at that time. So, go ahead, Jeff.
I read the Jeremiah passage as well, because I like to over prepare for things, and so just the first lines out of that. If you remove your detestable things from my presence and do not waver, if you swear as the Lord lives, in truth, in justice, and in righteousness. And this is what really got me at the end of verse 2. So first off, you do those things in truth, justice, and righteousness. So there's this kind of concrete, historical, social, holiness-oriented movement to the way that you're repenting. It says, then the nations shall bless themselves in him, and in him shall they glory. It's this return to Abraham, the promise to Abraham, that in you all the nations shall be blessed, or this shall bless themselves. What the Pharisees have done with the Sabbath and what they've done with work, the way that they've twisted, or at least the leader of the synagogue, is to make it something that's about work, or to make it something that's about Sabbath, and forget that Sabbath here always has the purpose of returning the people, and rest even has the purpose of returning the people into the purposes of God.
Right.
Rather than being something that is, just for its own sake. And, and we preachers and Christians in the church in kind of a workaholic culture, we always live in the in-between. I mean, I had somebody this week when I were talking about sabbatical on the board, and I had somebody go, I don't think that sabbaticals are legitimate. And the reason is, why would you need to take more time off, rather than recognizing, like, no, this is a practice that not only is committed in Scripture, but that's for returning the people of God, or for returning the leaders of the people of God into the purposes of God,
right,
in a deep way. So there's, for us to be able to kind of, we're not so much pressing against this Pharisaical culture that says, like, well, you just have to stop everything and sort of sit quietly. But we're pressing against a workaholic culture that's just as much a perversion of, a theologically oriented understanding of work. It's just
on the opposite side.
That's right. I mean, it doesn't matter which side you're on. If you're not in that, you're not in that space.
Yeah. What's so dominant in Protestant evangelicalism, it seems, though, is that we place the relationship with God, our personal relationship with Christ, above any sort of work that we do. So we're workaholics in every other situation except for church. Like we are complete slaves to everything else except for, why are we doing communion every Sunday? Or why do I give myself over to the work of the church? Why do I have to do these practices, and why does the doctrines or the creeds matter? Like, it just matters that I have a relationship with Christ. These rituals don't matter.
Except for pastors who die of heart attacks at 45.
Yeah, right.
But yeah.
Right. This, Jeff, going off of what you've said, and Ben, what you said, the return to me in truth, justice, and righteousness. Something that's been interesting to me as I think I have the book right around here, in Rediscovering an Evangelical Heritage, by Donald Dayton. He chronicles the justice movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and something that I've really kind of been ruminating over is the relationship between 20th century piety and 19th century justice. Because before the labor movement, you didn't have a weekend, right? It was the justice movement of the labor movement that said, it was started by the church. The church refused to participate in the labor injustices, and they said, no, we're not going to have our kids working in these factories. We're not going to work 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. There was this movement of justice, and that justice movement allowed us to have a weekend and permitted a Sabbath. Justice precedes piety. Justice precedes the moralism. So the justice of without the justice of the 19th century, you don't have the piety of the 20th century. And I think we can see part of that in this pericope, in that this leader of the synagogue is trying to propagate this piety, and this moral reality. You don't work on the Sabbath. There's 6 days to work. You do not work on the Sabbath, and he's chastising this woman. But Jesus is a man of justice and righteousness and truth. And what does he doesn't stand up for himself so much as he stands up for this woman who has just been chastised by the leader of the synagogue, and says, hey, our donkeys and our oxes, we lead them to water on the Sabbath, don't we? Why can't we free this woman from bondage? This daughter of Abraham, this incredibly dignifying title. He does not talk about her as if she's chattel. He talks about chattel, but then when he refers to her, he calls her a daughter of Abraham, this incredibly dignifying title. So Jesus is promoting this justice, not this piety in the absence of justice. It's not piety apart from righteousness and justice, but he's caring for the least of these in this incredible way, and even defending her against the established leadership of the synagogue.
I think that's right on. I think you also don't get the justice of the late 19th century without the piety of the Great Awakenings.
Sure. Sure.
So yeah, I mean, we live in a world where those things have been separated and divided, and if you want justice, you go to like Sojourner's magazine. If you want piety, you go to like Holiness Today. I don't know. I don't even read those magazines. But they've gotten divided, right, along kind of cultural lines, and anytime you try to bring one into the other, I mean, that's like the greatest sin, is to try to bring piety and justice together. I mean, that's, if you really want to make people mad, like go to a labor meeting and talk about prayer.
Yeah.
Or go stand up in a little conservative church or something like mine, and talk about
work.
Talk about
labor justice. Yeah. I mean, those aren't popular things. So yeah, I think you're right. There's one kind of theological piece that I think is really key is that let's see, both what the synagogue leader says in 14 and then how Jesus responds to it in 16, when in English, I forget what the NRSV said, if it was ought or should.
Yeah, the ought there
is super important in Luke.
Yeah.
To that anytime that word, I mean the Greek word is day, but DEI or delta epsilon anyway. Anytime that stuff shows up, especially in this section of Luke, there's this what you're seeing is Jesus narrating the central purposes of God, the central purposes of God for his people. So for him to say, ought not this woman, like you're saying, a daughter of Abraham, be loosed from bondage, is to say, that can be translated must as well, that this daughter of Abraham must be loosed from bondage. She must be freed, and there must be this kind of very particular and distinct direction. And I just love that he counters what the synagogue leader has to say.
Because he says ought.
Yeah, and he wants to make a particular claim about what it means to be human, and Jesus says, no, that's not what it is. And you see the synagogue leader lose out. He's put to shame, and the people rejoice at all the glorious things that were done by Christ. So there's that flip, but it's a great passage.
All right, so now let's switch gears a little bit, and let's talk about how we preach all of this that we've been discussing. What are some homiletical handles that we can use? What are ways in which we can make this text come alive for our congregations?
I think a key in what both you and Jeff have said is the preacher might do well to highlight the things that we rest in, like the synagogue leader rests in his definition of what work is, rather than what God calls him to rest in. And so we might be able to bring up these tensions that we have in our modern day church, like what Jeff says. We don't talk about prayer at a labor meeting. We don't talk about a labor meeting when we're praying, So we have these things that need to be divided in order for our definitions to hold sway. And what I've been kind of telling my congregation is like, the phrase I hear, and this may be a Boise, Idaho thing, I don't know, but the phrase I hear a lot is like, it's not a relationship. It's not a religion, it's a relationship. And I'm like, well, okay, that's great. I kind of understand what you're saying, but I feel like you're speaking beyond what you understand here. What sort of marriage would work well without any ritual? Like, how would your marriage fare if you forgot anniversaries or stopped saying I love you? Like, all these things that you do habitually, religiously to maintain that relationship. And their answer is 100% of the time it wouldn't. Like, okay, so what does this relationship with Christ entail then? What sort of habits, rituals, and practices that you do religiously go to add to the health of this relationship that you hold so highly? And so that tension that we kind of rest in, I only have a relationship, and that's the most important thing. It's like, oh, okay, well, the synagogue leader has a relationship with his definition of work that he's unwilling to break away from. So how does our relationship with Christ define what we do religiously, and what we do religiously add to the health of our relationship with Christ? It's a two-sided coin.
Those aren't mutually exclusive realities.
No, they're not.
And to bifurcate them perhaps might be terribly inappropriate.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. What else? What are some other ways that we can make this text come alive?
I think that talking about the question of freedom and the question of being loose from bondage, for Jesus to say this woman must be loose from bondage, she must be freed, is pretty powerful for us when we begin to consider what does it mean for us to be the church here. If we as the church don't have as a part of our self-understanding that it's our it's our job to participate in loosing the bonds of people. You know, that it's our job to participate in healing and in restoring people who have had what do you say, a non-divine understanding of themselves, you know, or a kind of, that was really kind of a pretentious thing to say, but I mean, pretty much folks that who have had an understanding of themselves that's been given to them by the world rather than one that's been given to them by God. And it's important and difficult for us to try to restore that that self-understanding.
And I think with that, Jeff, one of the questions I think would be good to ask alongside of that is, will we allow ourselves to be interrupted to do that? Will we let the typical actions, the typical life of the church to be interrupted so that we can provide healing and restoration for those people who are in desperate need of it? Jesus is in the middle of a sermon. He's interrupted. What if we're in the middle of a capital campaign? Or we're in the middle of service, or we're in the middle of whatever. We're going through the typical and good things that churches do. Will we permit those interruptions to give life to people who have been bound for 18 years? Jeff, something else you mentioned earlier that I think could be a nice homiletical handle is preaching this text from the opposite side, not from a culture that says you can't do anything on this day, but from our workaholic culture. Last week I was just curious. I was counting my hours last week to see how many hours I had put in that week, and I stopped counting on Wednesday when I hit 40. So I don't know how many I put in last week, but we live in a society that values busyness. We've got to be busy. We've always got to work. And so how do you approach this from the opposite end and say we live in a workaholic culture? Sabbath is important. How do you preach that in a text that says, hey, don't be doing anything on this day? Because it seems to me like that's an important message.
Well, I mean, I think the key in the text to Jesus healing and to his opposition of the leader is that what ought to be done on the Sabbath is restoration.
Right.
And that is, and then I think you can also come at it as, as an act of faith, that Jesus here is living and working in faith, that healing is going to take place. And we so often, like, our workaholicism is really a symptom of our disbelief. It's a symptom of our disbelief that God is the one doing the work, and our faith in ourselves, that we've got to go accomplish this. We've got to meet with this person, or nothing's going to happen in their lives. We've got to be the one who steps up and does the thing. And I mean, just speaking as pastors, it's really easy to begin to think of yourself as the one who accomplishes the work of the Spirit, rather than a tool that God uses at his choosing, and so an addiction to work really doesn't do anything.
It doesn't accomplish that.
Yeah, and so I think where you go is you just go to the text. You say, what does the text actually say about work? The text says that work is for restoration. The text says that that there need to be times for the purposes of God to break in, all of that kind of thing, and then you apply that culturally. Okay, where are we on the spectrum?
Right.
These are the ways that we transgress those boundaries. These are the ways that we're broken.
Yeah, very good.
And another thing I think is the question of shame and honor.
Yeah.
I don't know how often we either intentionally or unintentionally shame those who don't work versus honoring those who work too much. I mean, and that's part of the thing about being addicted to work, is that there is this kind of cultural honor to being somebody who overworks. You know, and you know, I mean, pastors complain about working too much, or they sort of they confess it, but sometimes I think they're a little too eager to confess.
It's a badge of honor.
Yeah, exactly. 70-hour work weeks, like, oh man, I just worked so hard, and you just want to go like, no, you're just kind of finding a way to brag about something.
Hey everybody, come and see how hard I work.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and as pastors, the tension is we do work a lot, but it's to make rest. I mean, it's as a sign of faithfulness, as a sign of trust that God is doing God's work in and through the church. So yeah, any final thoughts before we end this episode?
I think it's important as well that to see that the healing, as unlike some of the other events in Luke, the healing was not the main focus here.
Right. It's almost Johannine. It's almost a sign,
yes,
not so much a miracle.
Absolutely. So the greater points is what we have been trying to ruminate on during this episode. It's what does work mean?
Yeah.
How is it fused with the purposes of God? And does our work define our relationship with God, or does our relationship with God define our work?
Right. That's a good question.
Christ being the incarnation of God, being so God and humanity at one, his relationship with the Father defines his work.
Right.
And he is able to bring freedom and release the oppressed because of that relationship, and his work reflects that.
Yeah. Yeah. For this short passage, there's a lot to chew on. There's a lot to consider in preaching it. But preach well these great words. And Ben, great to be with you. Jeff, thank you for joining us today. Always great to have you here. And we'll let you get back to your 4-month-old child. Jeff, we look forward to hosting.
I'm not going to see my kid today. I work too much.
Oh, sorry. That's awesome. Well, great to be with you. We look forward to hosting you again in the future. And to our viewers, thanks for watching. Hope that this has been a good conversation for you in your sermon preparation. Make sure that you're checking out our commentaries. Ben wrote the commentary for Luke 13 this week, so that was a wonderful contribution there. Check it out. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, that whole shebang, and we'll see you here next week. Go in peace.